Hello, makers, and welcome to Making Conversation, a podcast where we celebrate all things making. As I said in the last episode, we're going to be re-recording some of the panels that we had at Flock Fiber Festival this last year. Today is going to be one of those. I'm going to be joined by two amazing makers, and we are going to be talking about addressing ableism in the maker community. But first, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here. Make sure that you subscribe and tell your friends about Making Conversation. I have some really awesome guests coming up, and I'm hitting the road to go to some other locations to do some filming. So it's definitely going to be worth checking it out. Also, just to touch on it really quick, in case you missed last week's episode and you've been around for a while, my eye is still a little poofy in this episode. It's a little bit more poofy than what it is now. And I just wanted to let everyone know I'm okay. I'm slowly healing. The swelling is coming down. I had a soft tissue infection in my face. And you know, we're on the tail end of it, but I just wanted to address that because it is fairly obvious in this episode. Anyways, let's get into why we are here today. The world of crafting and making should be a space where everybody feels welcome and empowered. However, there are barriers, both visible and invisible, that can exclude or marginalize makers with disabilities. We are going to chat about ways that ableism manifests itself within our community, and more importantly, how we can actively work to dismantle those barriers. I am joined by Kira and Beth. Kira is the brains behind Kira K Designs. Kira has been teaching fiber arts classes since 2002 and travels across the country. Her teaching focuses on providing valuable information in a stress-free environment and supporting students through the learning process. Kira also designs knitting and crochet patterns. You will also get to hear from Beth, the adaptive knitter. Beth is a passionate advocate for accessibility and inclusivity in crafting. Beth empowers crafters to embrace their unique abilities, fostering a supportive maker community and guiding individuals through the transformative potential of adaptation in her courses. So without further ado, let's jump into it. As we do with everybody on this podcast, I want to know each of your maker journeys. Where did everything begin? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first because I'm going to guess that I started earlier than Beth. I learned to crochet when I was 3 years old because my mom was adding another tier to a little rainbow crochet dress that I think my grandmother had made. And I was surprised that she opened a drawer in my house and it was full of yarn. And I got to choose the color for my clothing, which made me so excited and still does today. So that was the very beginning, and knitting and embroidery are pretty soon after that too.
Yeah, that's definitely earlier than me. I started knitting about 12 years ago when I joined my best friend Meg as a business partner in her dye business, Twisted Fiber Art. I was the business manager. So I was like, sure, I can help you get more eyes on your yarn. And she basically threw yarn at me. I mean, she just walked up to me with yarn and needles and dumped it on my desk and said, you're going to work for a yarn company. You're going to learn to knit or crochet or something. You got to learn something. So YouTube, my sister, I got going. I regret not learning from my meme, my grandmother, who tried to teach me when I was about 9 or 10, and my cousins were out playing in the yard and just wasn't the right time. I was not interested. But knowing now that I have that connection to her and to my other family members, my Aunt MJ in particular, who really, really were big influences for me in my growing up, and knowing that I'm doing what they did and what their mothers and grandmothers and everybody did. It's really a great connection for me. I love that kind of a connection. So I taught myself. My sister cast on for me and said, have fun.
I do feel like there is, like, it's kind of in our blood, right?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Once it's like further back in our families, it's kind of in our blood.
Oh, I think even just for humans, it's important to make stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like these days, a lot of people don't. They don't have to in the same way, but evolutionarily, like, we like tools. Tools are good.
Let's start off with defining ableism. What is it and how does it present itself in our communities?
You want me to take this one, Kira?
Yeah.
She's like, yeah. Well, this is my personal definition of ableism. I've done a lot of research on it. I've done a lot of talking with different communities within the disabled community. And this is kind of what I've brought to my own understanding of what ableism is. There's always more to be learned as we move forward. But for me, I describe ableism as the prejudice against individuals with disabilities. And this prejudice is based on the belief that able bodies are superior to disabled bodies, that there's something wrong inherently with being disabled, physically, mentally, emotionally, in any way that we are disabled, that there's something wrong with that and there's something to be fixed. Now, ableism doesn't always present outwardly, in a very poignant way. It sometimes does, and I felt that before. But just societally, in the words that we use, for example, if someone is in a wheelchair, you'll hear the terms like wheelchair bound. That term is an ableist term, and it makes it feel like someone is confined to this mobility tool that they use, when in fact this mobility tool that they use is freeing and makes the world accessible to them. And so that term, a wheelchair bound, is an ableist term. A better term would be wheelchair user. Just strictly, I'm an eyeglass wearer, and another person is a wheelchair user. So there's way more to it, but I mean, in the big picture, that's how I understand ableism and how I try to express it when people ask. Kira, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you've really worked hard on that. Like, I think that it's concise, considering it's such a huge topic. Like, that was concise and had good example.
What are some ways that bias and our own unchecked internalized ableism that we carry with us in our daily lives affects our fiber community events, gathering spaces, and even patterns themselves?
A lot of that is just that it makes it not welcoming to everybody who should be able to be part of our community, who is part of our community. You know, if spaces aren't accessible, that's really important for sure, to even let people get into the yarn store. I've absolutely been to yarn stores that you can't get into if you are a wheelchair user. It's important to note that we all have biases, whether we realize it or not, whether we're disabled or able-bodied. Like, this is built into our culture. So it's something that we have to actively think about and actively work towards eradicating in ourselves and others. I don't think I actually answered your question very clearly. Can you say the question again?
I can add on to that just a little bit. I think one of the things that is prevalent in our crafting communities is the belief that all crafters do things the same way. I think this is especially true in our knitting communities. I hate to, put that into a box, but I think crocheters are a little bit more open because there's so many different techniques you can hold your hook this way or that way or another way, and nobody's really saying, oh, you're doing that wrong, right? But in knitting, for some reason, and I'm not sure what this is yet. I'm trying to figure it out. I don't know that I ever will. People are told often that they're doing things wrong. They're holding the needles incorrectly, that they like, what are you doing with your finger? Why is it standing up? Right? Because everybody's body is so different. Mm-hmm. And it's more comfortable to hold things one way or another, and it works better for different bodies. But one of the things that we can do as a community is start to try and flip that switch, right? To change it into a more welcoming community by saying, if you're a crafter, if you're a knitter, or you're a crocheter, we welcome you and we can learn from each other. I believe that if you're a knitter, there's no wrong way to knit. If you are knitting and your end product looks the way you want it to look, then you did it correctly. My motto is done is the destination. How you get there is really about you and your body and how it works.
And there are so many different ways that you can hold your needles and yarn as a knitter. All those people saying you're doing it wrong probably have different ideas of what right is. And I always tell my students that if it's comfortable and it works, you are doing it right.
Mhm.
That's the
And you're a
important part.
wonderful teacher. I've heard other teachers, from people who said, well, when I learned, they said, no, you cannot hold your needles that way. This is the way you hold it, or you are not knitting. And that's how they learned. So breaking those ingrained, there's only one way to do things, getting those ideas out of your head is a really tough thing to do. That's that internalized part of the internalized ableism, and addressing that within yourself, and ideating about how your body feels when you hold it the way that you were told that you should hold it, right? Or you should make that motion for the throw or the flick or the wrap or the whichever way you do it, right? How does that make your body feel? Maybe it's not right for you. And that's a really tough thing to change. Habitual movements can cause major issues down the road. I mean, how many knitters do you know with carpal tunnel? I know a few. It's that repetitive motion and not being able to switch it up, right? That can cause real damage, truly.
And I think ergonomically, it's good for all of us to switch that up a little bit, right? Like to use your body in different ways, to have different styles that you knit, to have different crafts, so that when you want to keep crafting, you don't have to keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over. And of course, all of us are likely to at some point have some kind of an injury or a disability that's going to change how we're holding our yarn and our tools. So throughout your lifetime, it's likely to change at some point by necessity, if not by choice.
Right. Well, there's I hate to say this, but there's a statistic from the Social Security Administration that currently, this is, I think this is from 2023, so pretty recent, a 20-year-old worker in the United States has a 25% chance of becoming disabled before reaching the full retirement age. So that's 1 in 4 humans in our world who are now currently 20 years old in the workforce. And that disability may be organic. It may be something that they develop, but it also can be caused by injury and by aging and by repetitive movements. There are so many ways to disable your body or your brain in any way along that timeline. So yeah, it's really important to think now about how to help yourself should that occur in your lifetime.
I have a really easy thing to offer to people that's helped me to get away from the ableism, just looking at people in a craft group or a yarn store or a fiber festival. If somebody is in one of those places, assume that they like yarn and they know how to do something with it, or they want to learn, right? Like maybe they're brand new and they want to learn. It doesn't matter if you looking at them don't know how they can knit or crochet or whatever, or how they're going to manage to learn. Just assume they're here for it. And then you might find out later on, because maybe then that's going to let you befriend them and help them and teach them or whatever they're there for. And then eventually you'll figure out how they're doing their craft. But that doesn't need to be where you start with them.
We're all there for the love of what we do, right?
Yeah.
Or the love of what we want to be doing. So I think that's a really good point. You mentioned, going into like yarn shops and being like, this isn't really set up for everyone. What are some things that maybe some shop owners can be looking at when they are setting up their shop to make sure that their yarn is available for everyone and people can move through their space in a comfortable way?
I mean, I think things like the stairs are pretty obvious. So when scoping out a location, to check in for accessibility, if there's a bathroom, if it's one that people can get into, if they're wheelchair users or walker users. The baskets on the floor get me so much at yarn shops, and it's usually like baskets of stuff that doesn't sell. And it should be moved out of that shop entirely, but it just sits there blocking the walkways.
Yeah, aisles are a big one. Yarn stores are notoriously packed, right? If you walk in, you want to see everything. And so they try and put everything out. But what that does is it narrows aisleways. It makes things go vertically. I can't tell you how many yarn stores I've been in where you've had to ask for help to get something. And I'm 5'7", right? So reaching up onto shelves or having to jump or, get on a stool or something to get things. Also lighting. Lighting's really, really, really big. It's not something that a lot of people think about. Yarn stores think about it a little bit because they want to have a space where you can take the yarn to look and see what it looks like. But I've been in ones that say, just go outside and bring it back in, because the lighting is terrible. And for those with low vision, that is a really, really hard thing. And for those with migraines, that lighting can be a really big issue if you're trying to look at the details and it's a yellow light or it's a fluorescent light, then it's really, really rough to see. And again, for low vision users, this goes back even to the yarn dyers, right? Larger fonts, making sure that those yarn details are in a place where they're easily seen and that they're dark enough contrast that I can look at it and say, okay, this is an MCN and it is a fingering weight, not having to go ask for help. That font and contrast is a really big thing. And that goes even back before the yarn stores get the yarn.
I also think on in a very different note that's not exactly about the accessibility is that it's important for everyone, every business owner, but let's talk about yarn store owners, to do some training for their staff on ableism, on accessibility, on diversity, on equity, like all that stuff is just so important to make sure the staff is on board. Because if the owner is, that doesn't mean it's always happening.
Yeah, that leans into the social exclusion. That is part of ableism and internalized ableism that just happens in a community of any kind, right? So if you're holding a knit night, is it accessible to all? Can someone come in and participate? So the social exclusion, not just can they get physically to the group, but kind of going back to what Kira said earlier, are they included in the group? Do you assume that they are knitters or they are crocheters when they join your group? And are you welcoming to their adaptive style, whatever that may be, right? It's very easy if you're feeling uncomfortable with somebody, if there's a physical difference that you see or otherwise that just you feel a little difference and it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, it's easy to retreat. It's easy to pull back and kind of turn your chair to talk to the people who you're comfortable talking with. Being open, right? Making a conscious decision to sit back at the table so that you are addressing everyone at the table. That's a great first step into addressing your own internalized ableism and understanding that difference is good and it adds to the overall group as a whole.
It's important to keep in mind that you should be doing this whether or not there are people in the room who you think are disabled, because there's so many different things under that. And you don't know anyone's story and the story of their close family and friends and just how they're paying attention to this. But people are definitely paying attention, and they might quietly leave and not give you the feedback because it's hard for them to give you the feedback, and it's exhausting to do that all day, every day, wherever they go. Making sure that you're practicing this not for disabled people, but so that we're all making our society in general more inclusive.
We talked about physical spaces. Let's talk about patterns really quick. What are some ways that designers can be more inclusive with their patterns when they're putting those out into the world?
Oh my gosh, font size is huge. I was just teaching a class. Nobody in the room, to my knowledge, had low vision, and we all were really having trouble reading something I think was like 8-point font. And it was a new pattern. It was not an old pattern. It's like a holdover from when it was really expensive to print, I think. And so the magazines and books would all just like shrink it and condense it as much as possible. But it was so teeny tiny that I can't imagine anyone with a low vision being able to read that. I also think it can be helpful to have things available so that people can use software to get the information. I have students that have asked for the PDF of the handout in advance so that they can have a device that puts it into Braille for them so that they can follow along what's written down on the paper without seeing it. Customizing patterns too is huge. And of course, there's so many kinds of bodies out there, right? So you can't put in the information to customize for absolutely everybody in the world. But leaving spaces for that, I think, can be really helpful to let people think about how they might want to customize it for their body.
That's a really great point. Another thing that is important is having written and charted instructions both. If you are able to do that, people process information in much different ways. I'm a very, very visual person. And before I learned how to read a chart, I had trouble following a pattern, highlighting that line of text, making sure I was keeping track of where I was in that repeat was really difficult. But the moment I learned how to read a chart and visualize the stitches as they occur in my knitting, that made a really big difference for me. So different learning styles. That's why written and charted things are really great to have.
And schematics.
And schematics. That was what I was going to
Yes.
say. If you cannot do a chart, you can do a schematic. That is something that is not too difficult to do. So people can have a pretty basic understanding of what this thing that they're making should look like, so they can kind of check themselves along the way and rip back if they need to.
I love the intro paragraph too, to be like, this has worked from the top down.
Yeah.
Like sometimes the intro paragraph is just poetry about how you'll feel when you're wearing this thing. Mine are like very specific about how it's made, what direction it goes, what kind of yarn would be really helpful if that's necessary. And for people who have trouble with the dense pattern text, they won't figure that stuff out until it's too late.
I was just going to add contrast. That's the only other thing. Make sure that your font is dark and your background is light, whatever combination that may be. And if you go online and you Google good, colors for contrast in text, there are lots of things out there to tell you about which colors read better than others. If you want to get fancy and you don't want to be black and white, there are other options out there, some navies and some creams and pinks and other things if you need to get fancy, which is great. We all want to be fancy. We wouldn't be makers if we didn't. But really put some thought into that before you begin.
Mm-hmm. And the font itself, like the sans serif fonts are just easier for everybody to read. And there are lists of fonts that are easier to read. That pretty.
There's a whole list for dyslexic friendly fonts that are really, and that I figure if they are good for that, they're good for everything. They're just means that it's simpler for your eye to absorb and your brain to absorb the information.
How my brain works, my ADHD brain, when the opening paragraph isn't fluffy, it's just like, here's how it's going to go. And or even if they're like, read the whole pattern before you start. Of course, I've been knitting for years, and that is something that I should do anyways. But when they tell me to do it, it's like, okay, there's a real reason here. You can have fluffy, fun things, but also that opening paragraph where it's like, let's break this down before you jump in. It's really nice.
I love too that now as a pattern writer, we have all this technology. So I can have a video tutorial of an unusual stitch. I can link out to a spreadsheet that has a tab for every single size and a chart of on your sweater yoke, for example, like when you're decreasing for the body, for the sleeves, for the neck. Like I'll have the information, the pattern in, every so many times for this person, kind of a format, but to have that link out to spreadsheets that people who have trouble organizing the information don't have to. I've done that. I didn't print an extra 10 pages because I do sell printed copies and I'm not going to do that. But it at least has that option for the folks who need it.
I love the video option. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really nice. So the last question that we have, I feel like we've covered, but maybe there's something that we haven't. But how can allies help and take action?
We've kind of done a lot of that, haven't we?
I know we have.
We've done it as we went through. Yeah.
Let me just say that I tell everybody, it's the first thing that you need to think about when you start a conversation with any person is start as you'd like to end. So whether you know this person is disabled or not, begin the conversation that you're having, understanding that everybody thinks, feels, and acts differently. And so to be open and to be, to be learning at all times, right? Being a human in our world means we need to be looking forward, next to, and behind us all at the same time. I say it's kind of like driving a car. You need to be aware of what's going on around you, what people are doing, and how you should respond in those given situations. But one of those things is being able to adapt your styles to others. People with disabilities don't need to be the person making all the concessions. They are already conceding in most areas of their lives. They should not have to take on that burden in a conversation as well. So begin a conversation knowing that accommodations are going to be made because that human is not you and they are a different human. And so they're not going to think exactly the same way. I mean, that's the gist of my message.
It's also important for able-bodied people to pay attention to this, not just ourselves, but with the spaces. Like, I can tell the yarn store owner about something that doesn't seem accessible for people, even if it's not affecting me at this moment. And for all of us, I think that's going to make it a better crafting community to be more inclusive. It's not just for those people who maybe haven't always been as easily included. It's for all of us. It's going to make it more diverse and more interesting. It doesn't have to be necessarily that you are doing a service for disabled people. Like, this should be something that we all want to do and work towards that goal in the end of being fully inclusive. And of course, that's true for other marginalized people as well. Like, this is just one piece of that puzzle.
This is a tiny, one piece. Definitely start following some disabled makers on Instagram and Facebook. It's time to start normalizing the fact that we exist and that we are part of this community and that we are making some pretty incredible pieces of fiber art out there in our world. So look for and follow and engage with disabled makers.
When people are communicating things to these shop owners or designers or whatever, always leading with kindness and compassion, because I think that if we are in a different spot in our journey of becoming more inclusive, sometimes it can feel like we need to jump into everything with a lot, right? And I think just making sure that everyone's always kind to each other about things, because you never know what other people are going through. Is there anything else that either of you would like to share before we wrap up?
Well, you can find me on Instagram. I'm a disabled maker, and you can find me on Instagram, adaptiveknitter.com. I teach about adaptive knitting techniques and how to help people learn to knit or relearn the art of knitting after injury or disability of some sort, medical or otherwise. I mean, our bodies are changing every single day, and what you were yesterday is not what you are today. So I'm here to help you find the techniques that work for you.
Do you have any suggested hashtags that people might want to follow to help them find the makers on social media?
Yeah, I use Adaptive Maker all the time, and there are many others, Adaptive Maker out there. You can also look for Disabled Maker, Disabled Knitter, Disabled Crocheter. I mean, the list goes on. Put disabled in front of any topic that you're interested in, and there's some content out there to be consumed. There's some really great ones. Other things are Disabled Knitters of Instagram. That's a really fun hashtag to follow. You get, the spectrum for disability is as big as there are people in the world. So seeing the way that people interact with fiber or with fabric or with pottery or with woodworking, there's so many different makers in our world. Disabled Makers of Instagram is a really fun one to follow.
And it's always good when you are coming into somebody's space like that to listen for a while. Like, check, they might have a bio post pin, they might have some story highlights, something that explains what you're wondering about, if you are. But it's always, I think, good practice when you're going into a space of marginalized people to not just come in hot and asking questions. Like, stay and listen for a little bit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can I plug one account that I love?
Plug away.
I think she's doing phenomenal things for our industry. I follow her. I communicate with her through her posts as often as I can. It's the Anti-Ableist Makers Society. Makers? Yeah. And I think it's a dot. So anti.ableist.makers.society. And she's just wonderful, has really great things to say, and she posts when she can. But I think she starts a lot of great conversations, and I'm always eager to see what she's putting out next and contribute to that conversation. I just find her amazing.
Kira, where can everybody find you online and otherwise?
I'm lucky enough to have an unusual first name. So if you just Google Kira Knitting or Crochet, you'll probably find me. But my handle is Kira K Designs. So that's my website, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, everything.
All right. Anything else that we want to say before we wrap up?
I mean, we could talk for hours, but I think we covered what we can in this time.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, both of you. And if anyone ever has questions or anything, obviously it's great to do your own research, but drop them in the comments and I'll ping Beth and Kira and be like, we've got a question for you. We'll get those answered. All right.
All right. Thank you so much, Jen. This was wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Nice to have a little bit more space and time to focus on just doing this and not being on stage with all those wonderful people out there.
As always, we probably could have had a much longer episode going into many more topics about how we could be more inclusive in the maker community. But I think that this is a good start. If you have any suggestions or ways that you are more inclusive for everybody within our community, drop them in the comments below. I think that sometimes, reading something or hearing something that might be obvious to you at the time, but maybe nobody else thought about, can be super helpful. So definitely make sure to share those below. Subscribe to the podcast, tell your friends, and we will be back next week with more Making Conversation. In the meantime, enjoy working on those whips, and we will see you next week.